Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. Quickly for our Chinese-speaking audience, 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. Okay, Richard, so we are having a meeting once again on Zoom, and I see we're both in slightly different settings. I sometimes visit my spouse in San Francisco, and it's early July as we record. So I'm back visiting her and my cats right now. But I've been kicked out because she has a lot of work to do. And understandably, she doesn't want to just tiptoe around while we're recording. So I'm now borrowing the philosophy lab on the campus of San Francisco State University. They are kind to let me...
Where you taught for many, many years.
Yes, exactly. So it's my old stomping grounds, as we sometimes say in English, my familiar home, familiar territory that I spent a lot of time in. Mm-hmm. So I always feel a little bit nostalgic when I'm here. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at you. You're also in a different place. Usually when I'm talking to you, you're either in what I unofficially call your recording studio in your home, which looks like sort of an attic that doubles as a playroom or something. And then, right. Or you're at a public library. But now what? It's like a study room or something, or presentation room?
Yep. So I am coming in from the campus of the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. I'm actually at what's known as the Duncan Student Center. And it's a gigantic center that they created long after I graduated from here as a graduate student. And on one of the floors, the fifth floor in particular, they created this like 65 study room section for students who are doing Zoom or online interviews. They also have like actual companies come and interview students for jobs. So anyways, it's used as a study room by many students. During the academic year, it's so full, I probably can't get anything. But during the summer, it is July, so I can actually get one of these really nice rooms, and it's relatively empty. There's a gym just a couple floors down. I worked out there earlier. And so, that's what's been going on. And in the summer, I also, as you know, I chauffeur my kids all the time. So I'm just taking them to different sports camps and tennis lessons and gymnastics lessons. And that's basically what I do. I just drive them around, and that's about half of my life.
Driving your kids as a chauffeur. That's right.
Yep, that's what I do.
Yes, to you, it probably seems like a relief when the school year starts, and at least you have just one or two destinations to bring them all to, and then you can leave them there for most of the day.
I think there are movies or shows where it shows the parents just counting the days until summer ends and they begin their fall session. And the first day of school, they start cheering and they can't wait for the kids to be back in school.
Yes. Well, it's very endearing, actually, that you do that for your kids. I can just picture it. And I've visited friends. I don't have children myself, but I visited friends when they were in the middle of that peak chauffeur period of life where their kids have many, many activities. Evening activities, summer activities, and it just seems that all they do is drive them from one place to another. Yeah. And let me just quickly comment that it's very savvy of Notre Dame. It's very strategically, it seems like really a great idea to have a building full of these rooms that are basically there just for practice interviews and for actual Zoom interviews, so that the students don't have to rely on kicking their roommates out or finding a kitchen or bedroom from which to hold their interview. It seems like a very good thing to do for students.
Yes. And of course, it came out of a large donation. So there's I forgot what the name was, but some family donated a lot of money and created these really nice rooms.
Yep. That seems to me like a good move on their part. Yeah. So today's topic is one that I think you and I are excited about because we're professional philosophers and we like to think about arguments. But I think the best way to put it is, stop me if you disagree, Richard. We're talking about the doctrine that Mohism is best known for, which is, we're going to translate it as impartial caring. That's our translation of jian'ai. But it's not just that. It's also two arguments for the doctrine. One we're calling the Caretaker Argument. The other we're calling the Filial Piety Argument. These are the names for these arguments we're taking from Brian Van Norden. He wrote a book, and the terms that he applied to the two arguments have become influential. It's nice to have a shorthand to refer to them. So we're not just going to discuss impartial caring, which itself is very interesting and controversial. We're going to look at two of the arguments for it. And this is an opportunity, I think, for us to look at the more recognizably, sort of familiarly philosophical side of the classical Chinese tradition. Something that Western philosophers who only have kind of a passing acquaintance with Chinese philosophy may not know about, is that there are these texts in the classical tradition which read more like traditional philosophical texts, where they make claims, they offer arguments, sometimes they even sort of establish success criteria and then talk about whether a particular argument meets the success criteria or not. The Mohists are very good about that, about making their arguments very clear. And yet, because it was an old text etched onto bamboo scripts using classical Chinese, which is, sort of lacks some of the precision of most modern languages, it's still full of ambiguity, which means that you and I are going to geek out a little bit and discuss the pros and cons of the arguments and the proper interpretation of them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm excited about looking into the jian'ai doctrine and exactly what that amounts to, and the two arguments, which I found quite intriguing. I teach them to my students, and they are more widely discussed today, I think, than in the past. And so it'll be nice to look at, well, what exactly is the argument, themselves? And so it'll be interesting to discuss all that with you, Justin.
Yes. Yeah. So prepare yourselves, and we look forward to saying more about it after the intermission. Okay, we're back, and we're going to discuss today two arguments for impartial caring, which is the translation that we're going with of this Chinese phrase jian'ai. Jian'ai is often said to be a core doctrine of Mohism, one of the most discussed, most widely debated. One of the central chapters in the Mozi is basically titled jian'ai. Jian is often translated as something like collectively or together, and I is translated as care. This is the same I that if you speak modern Chinese, you think of it as the word for love, but in classical Chinese, it's best understood as in the more minimal sort of pro-attitude that we call caring or concern for others. There are other ways of interpreting this phrase, depending on how radical or how strong a claim you want the Mohist to be making, and perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss it, but we're going to go with jian'ai. Now, many of you probably have heard episode 17, which was the first episode where we discussed the Mohists, but having spoken to a lot of listeners, just in the last few months, I realized many people jump around, so you may have no idea who the Mohists are. The Mohists are not well known nowadays. Nowadays, if you were to ask what were the great classical schools of thought in China, people would say Taoism, maybe legalism, certainly Confucianism. They wouldn't mention Mohism. But if you could travel back in time and ask people of that era, particularly people of this educated class, the sometimes called the Shi class, the kind of scholar, gentleman class, the class of people who worked in the service of governments, people in that class would say Mohism is definitely in the running for one of the most influential schools of thought in this classical period. And the Mohists wrote these very interesting treatises. Originally, there were 3 surviving versions of each one on their core doctrines, which had to do with frugality in funerals, defensive warfare. They were sort of against more aggressive forms of warfare. And among other things, impartial caring, jian'ai. So we're going to be looking at the third of those 3 surviving chapters on jian'ai. That's chapter
16.
16, yes, which is often said to be the most developed chapter, one that has the most sophisticated arguments, in some ways perhaps the most demanding interpretation of the doctrine. And we're going to be looking at 2 arguments for that particular view. One we're calling, following Brian Van Norden, the Caretaker Argument. The other we're calling the Filial Piety Argument.
So yeah, we're going to explore these 2 arguments from chapter 16 of the Mozi. And the arguments are aimed at showing why we should prefer impartiality. Now, in chapter 16, there's an earlier part to it that we won't have time to discuss. But there's a kind of background that I think, Justin, you might want to fill the listeners in. It has to do with why exactly we should care about impartiality.
Yes, right. Okay, so there are lots of arguments in this chapter. And let me just say that there's one that I think of as sort of the main argument. Other people have called it that. For example, Loi Huijie, who is a major scholar of Mohism in Singapore, he calls it the main argument. Chris Fraser calls it the argument from consequences, I believe. Maybe the argument from good consequences. I can't quite recall. But anyway, it's a very straightforward argument. It identifies 8 harmful behaviors, 8 evils in the world, we might say. Some of them have to do with the powerful or the strong bullying the weak. Some of them have to do with relationships being dysfunctional. So parents, fathers not being sufficiently compassionate or caring of their children, children not being sufficiently filial. But anyway, all 8 of these evils, which are familiar enough if you live in imperfect times, and I think everyone does, will know about these evils. It's always true that big, powerful states bully the weaker ones, and big, powerful people and families and so on bully those who don't have so many resources and power at their disposal. So all those things are familiar. And it says, well, what is the problem? What is the source of these evils? And it turns out it's what they call bie in Chinese, which is often translated as partiality, or separateness, treating oneself or seeing oneself as separate. And so then jian'ai, impartial caring, is supposed to be the solution to these problems. That's the main argument. And we're not going to discuss it so much because, well, first of all, it's relatively straightforward. But we will at least say that it gives us some clue or some hint as to what this doctrine jian'ai actually means. I mean, if you really drill down and think about what it means to care about other people impartially, there's a lot of ambiguity. Like, does it mean that in all things you regard them impartially? Which is to say, like, in every single respect, you have the same emotional feelings and attitudes towards them that you do toward yourself and toward your family members? There are parts of this chapter, chapter 16, which seem to suggest it does. It says that people who practice jian, impartialism, really do regard others as they regard themselves. They regard what belongs to others, their bodies, their families, and so on, as they would regard their own bodies and families. But that's still ambiguous. I mean, for example, here's one way in which it's ambiguous. Let's say that I hear a story, elicits great compassion for me about someone who's just barely survived the floods and lost many family members in a great flood or what have you. And so I feel a sense of compassion for them. And briefly, I will describe myself as having feelings of compassion for their suffering similar to feelings that I would have for my own suffering, right? That's one way of basically spelling out what it's like to be in a state of compassion or sympathy, right? Is that you suddenly take someone else's suffering and regard it in the same way that you regard your own. But that doesn't actually imply that I feel the same strength of response to their suffering as I would my own. My own would haunt me in a much deeper and more enduring, agonizing way than someone else's would. It also doesn't necessarily mean that it motivates me as strongly as it would my own suffering, right? So similarly for this idea, this doctrine of jian'ai, it's not entirely clear what it means to be impartial in one's caring about others. Does it mean that you essentially meet some minimum threshold of caring for others just because they're fellow human beings or something, and you don't necessarily discriminate against people who aren't yourself or your family members or connected to you in some way? Or does it mean more strongly that you care about them equally, right? That you have the same strength of motivation and concern for them, that you want to promote their interests just as much as you want to promote the interests of your own family members? There's a lot of debate about that. And I think we can say relatively neutrally for now that you get some sense of what it is that they understand jian'ai to mean just by looking at these evils that they hope to overcome. So strong states bullying the weak, strong people bullying weak people, family members not getting along well. Somehow jian'ai, impartial caring or impartial concern, is supposed to be the cure for those particular problems.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so the 2 arguments that we examine in just a moment is meant to also help show why we actually ought to prefer impartial care over partial care, as I understand these arguments. It's supposed to show in some ways why actually, in some sense, you already do think impartial care is what you would rather have exist in the world generally. I think that's the conclusion, at least of this first argument, known as sometimes the caretaker argument. I guess it was Brian Van Noorden who coined that term.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to be reading this argument. Translation is by Philip J. Ivanhoe and comes from chapter 16 of the Mozi. So should I read it, Justin?
Yeah, it's great. Let's get into it. This is the Mohists on this hypothetical case where you are probably a male head of household and you're about to go on a dangerous mission. And that means that you could be away for some time. You could perhaps die on your mission. And you want to make sure that your family is cared for in your absence, either during the long time that you're away, months or years, or perpetually if you die and never come back. And so to whom would you entrust the care of your family? That's the question. And the argument's meant to show that you would prefer someone who's impartial. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's the passage. says, suppose one must put on one's armor and helmet and go to war in a vast and open wilderness where life and death are uncertain. Or suppose one was sent by one's ruler or high minister to the distant states of Ba, Yue, Qi, Jing, and could not be sure of either reaching them or ever returning from one's mission. Under such conditions of uncertainty, to whom would one entrust the well-being of one's parents, wife, and children? Would one prefer that they be in the care of an impartial person, or would one prefer that they be in the care of a partial person? I believe that under such circumstances, there are no fools in all the world. Even though one may not advocate impartiality, one would certainly want to entrust one's family to the person who is impartial. But this is to condemn impartiality in word, but prefer it in deed, with the result that one's actions do not accord with what one says. And so, I don't see what reason any person in the world who has heard about impartiality can give for condemning it.
Yes, that's right. So the argument presents you, the reader, or you, the listener, with a dilemma. You have to entrust your family to some sort of caretaker, and you have to choose between the partial and the impartial person. It's just in case it's not yet clear, there is an earlier passage, one that we're not including because it's just too much text, but I'll read it, a little bit of it to you briefly, that describes the attitudes of the partial person and the impartial person. So the partial person says things like, how can I possibly regard the well-being of my friends, or even the body of my friends, the self of my friends, as I do my own? How can I possibly regard the parents of my friends as I do my own parents? So the partialist seems to sort of invoke, I don't know, kind of psychological realism or something, to say, oh, it's not possible to be that impartial. And so it goes on to say, when his friends are cold, he does not clothe them. When his friends are ill, he does not nurture them. And when his friends die, he does not bury them. That's what the partial person says and does. And then it contrasts it with the kind of the thoughts or the views, the attitudes of the impartial person, who says, I have heard that in order to be a superior person in the world, one must regard the well-being of one's friends as one regards one's own well-being. One must regard the parents of one's friends as one regards one's own parents. Only this way can one be a superior person. So essentially, the choice is between two profiles, two sort of psychological dispositions. One person who regards others as he regards himself, another one who does not. And so the question is, to whom would you entrust your family? I think it's pretty clear. Obviously, you would entrust your family to the impartial person. That person is going to take better care of your family in your absence than the partial person would. And moreover, it says, well, if that's the case, then if you condemn impartiality as like the wrong doctrine or the wrong way of life to pursue, but nevertheless endorse it as the doctrine that your friends, the caretaker friends, should have, then, as the text says, that is to condemn impartiality in word, but prefer it in deed, with the result that one's actions do not accord with what one says. So just to make the kind of what we might call the logical structure of the argument really clear, it seems like it's leveraging this notion that non-contradiction is something to be avoided, right? Like there is some kind of internal inconsistency in your beliefs, perhaps, or at least in a belief and in a professed belief, something that you say, when you, on the one hand, endorse impartialism in caretaker friends, and on the other hand, endorse partialism as a kind of way of life to adopt.
Mm-hmm. There's some kind of inconsistency there. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, what this argument seems to be going for is that you prefer other people to be impartial, right? But it doesn't necessarily imply that you yourself ought to be impartial. So I was wondering about that. It's not, it doesn't quite get you to that conclusion. It does get you to the conclusion that you do want the person you're entrusting your family to, you want that person to be impartial, at least impartial in the sense that the person would also take care of your family the way that he would, let's say, take care of his own family. Yeah. So I found that to be kind of interesting.
Okay, right. Actually, this does come up sometimes in the secondary scholarship on the Mozi. That is, stuff written by people nowadays about the Mozi. Yeah, the worry is it seems like it's trying to call attention to a internal inconsistency or some kind of contradiction in the beliefs of the so-called partialist. insofar as he wants to entrust his family to the impartialist friend. But there is a way of making it more logically consistent, which is to say, oh, well, I'm an impartialist in my choice of friends, but I'm still a partialist for myself. Like in most of my things, in most things that I do, I act on either my own best interest or my family's best interest. But when it comes to finding a friend to take care of my family in my absence, I will look for an impartialist. There's nothing logically inconsistent with that, right? It's like, that's a perfectly logically consistent way of describing the view. Maybe I'm using the word logic in a way that is a little esoteric. If you're a philosopher, you know what I mean, but people who don't have a lot of training in philosophy, I'm now using this word logic basically as a kind of crude approximation of something like the formal rules of inference that we're allowed to follow. And so you take away all the substance and content and just talk about formally speaking, which rules of inference are safe ones and which ones are not. And there are certain basic principles like non-contradiction or modus ponens, which applies to if-then statements, which we're required to follow insofar as we want to make formally, logically safe or valid claims. So yeah, the point is, it seems like it's not considering all the possible logical moves available to the partialist. And so you point to one of them. So in the secondary scholarship, I'm thinking primarily of Chad Hansen, but also Chris Fraser, I think, exploits this idea somewhat. There's this view that when the Mohists bring up the caretaker argument, they are presupposing that there's this object of debate that we might call a social way or a social Tao. That is, they're not now talking about practices that can be tailored to your own personal circumstances. That's just not even in view as something to be argued about. Instead, they're talking about practices that are meant to be adopted socially, So I'm trying to think of a good analogy. If we can't coherently speak of fame as something that inheres in one person intrinsically all by herself, just as we can't talk about social rituals as something that one person practices all by herself because they're inherently social, right? So too, are they talking about a Tao that can't just be a way, Tao understood as this term that's been translated as way, that one person practices all by him or herself. So it's more or less a debate about social Taos. And as a social Tao, so like what would you want for everyone in society if you're a male head of household about to go on a dangerous mission and have a family that needs caring? Well, probably you would want, maybe you're tempted to make a special exception of yourself, but that's just not a move that's permitted to people in this context, since we're talking about social Taos. That's the kind of Chad Hansen view. For what it's worth, I see Chris Fraser as building on it. Brian Van Norden, in his book on consequentialism and virtue ethics in the classical Chinese tradition, responds to that move. He has a rather long response to it, but it's one move available to the Mohists here. Yeah.
I remember Van Norden in that book also talking about how someone might argue that, well, actually, what you would want is a partial person, but a partial person who really prefers your family, right? Because I guess like one worry might be if you say just simply an impartial person, then what if there's like another family that comes along and is in dire need? And if that family is in maybe even in greater need, maybe the impartial person would now neglect your family that was supposed to be taken care of and go for this third family who's in even a worse off situation. And so now your family is neglected because the impartial person is tending to the needs of maybe third or fourth or fifth families. Yeah, I remember, so it's been a while since I'm reading Brian Van Norden's treatment of this, but he does raise this really interesting issue because, isn't the best idea to have the partial person who prefers his own family, but also your family equally? Yeah, why isn't that more preferable? So maybe one thing to note here is maybe the Mohists are thinking of impartiality in a narrower scope. So they're not talking about impartially in every situation or in every respect, but in this case, impartial between their own family and your family, not just all families. Maybe that would be the response.
Yeah. So I think that we can put a name to this. We can say it's the response that says the Mohists have committed a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. Right. So they presented the reader, the listener, with two options. But there are many other options, potential options in play, which could help us get around the sort of strong commitment to what seems like a strong view, impartial caring in Mohism. So why is it a false dichotomy? Well, because it seems like the two options are either complete impartiality, where you treat all people, whether they're members of your family or members of a complete stranger's family or members of your friends' families or whatever, in roughly the same way, right? That's the Mohist version of impartial caring. Or on the other hand, you have this kind of my family first, everyone else be damned view, like essentially only my family's well-being matters and no one else's family matters. And of course, if that's the option, then the impartialist will be preferable to the partialist. But there's this other view in play here, at least if you've been reading or somehow immersed in the Confucian tradition at this time, which is sometimes known as the doctrine of graded love or care with distinctions, which sees the commitments, the obligations that we have towards others as in terms of something like concentric circles, where you have the strongest commitment or obligation to your own immediate family, yes. But then just, one or two circles out from that are commitments to your very close friends, right? Which are stronger than commitments to total strangers, or citizens of foreign countries that you've never been to, or, other places where you have no sort of deep interpersonal or meaningful connections or shared community. So if the view is concentric circles, then, which is understood as a pretty canonical interpretation of Confucian care with distinctions or graded love, then actually you'd probably be better off with a Confucian-style partialist. Why? Because the Mohist-style impartialist, if there's if there's a famine or something, he's going to treat your family as making more or less the same demands on him as his own family, sure, but also as total strangers' families, So there's going to be no special privileging of your family over and against total strangers. And if a case could be made for feeding, in the case of famine, a stranger's family rather than your own, maybe there are more lives to save or something, then I guess he will. It seems like he's committed to that view. This is the worry that is articulated in the false dichotomy charge. But in fact, there's this other option, which is that your friend could be, being your close friend, prioritizing your family, your interests, your family's interests more highly than total strangers. That's the natural way of reading Confucianism. Friends and friends' families are closer to the center of the concentric circles than total strangers, and that's an actual advantage for you. So if you had the option of choosing a Confucian-style partialist as opposed to this extreme my family, everyone else be damned style partialist, then you would do that. That's one move available.
Now, in this passage, though, it doesn't say that you're deciding to give or entrust your family to a partial or impartial friend or someone you're connected to. It just says a partial or impartial person, right? So I guess in this, at least as the way that the thought experiment goes, offered by the Mohist in this passage, it doesn't seem like it does involve the special concentric circle relations that might be really important for the Confucians. Although the thought I had was, but in virtue of someone agreeing to take care of your family, now you do have a kind of bond or some kind of relationship to this family. Yeah. So maybe that's enough to bring in the Confucian view anyways. Even if it's not necessarily a friend, I would imagine the Confucians would be supportive of this idea that, well, look, you promised this person, he's not really a stranger anymore because you said you would take care of him or his family. Yeah. And so now the family is kind of like, you have a real kind of a bond and relationship to them. So you should be partial to them than just some random families that you've heard about in, even if it's maybe nearby in your community. Yeah.
So the passage in English, the paragraph prior to the one that we read, does use this word yo, which means friend. Mm-hmm. So if we take that prior paragraph to be setting the stage for the dilemma as you've read it, then yes, in fact, it is. We are asking which friend are you going to entrust your family to? Mm. Right, strictly speaking, in that paragraph, it doesn't use that word. So maybe the paragraph you read, insofar as these texts do seem to be collections of different passages from different sources, maybe they were envisioning a slightly different thought experiment.
Okay, yeah.
But it still stands as a good objection, the worry that this is kind of a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. It seems like there should be more than these two choices. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let me just say a little bit more about the context of the passage. I think we've read enough to give listeners a sense of how the arguments go and give them a sense of how it is that there seems to be something like a principle of non-contradiction or logical consistency that's doing some of the work here. but it's not entirely clear how we're supposed to use it and what options are available to us. But let me just say a little bit more about it. So actually, the whole caretaker argument is introduced as a response to an objection. And the objection is something like, can it be applied? So if you look back at the full context, you'll see that there's basically, it's begun with what we're calling the main argument, which shows that there are good consequences. It's good for society if people adopt impartial caring. But then someone comes along and raises this objection. Okay, granted that it's a good thing, but can it be applied, right? And he uses this Chinese term yong, which sometimes is translated as used, but can also be translated as applied. And so some of the scholars who want to offer what we might call a more charitable, defensible, plausible interpretation of the caretaker argument latch onto that. Here I'm thinking primarily of Fraser and say, so here he's not just asking, give me a kind of overall justification for impartial caring from the ground up. Instead, he's asking, can it be applied? Can it be adopted as a kind of social doctrine, as a social way that everyone in a particular society or community will practice? Mm-hmm. And at least according to Fraser, that lowers the evidential standard somewhat. You don't have to prove that it's the best of all options. You just have to show that, given that it's a very good option for good consequentialist reasons, in terms of the overall net benefit for everyone, can we reasonably expect that if everyone were to adopt it, it would be something that they would endorse, that it would actually be enacted, something like that, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, also that it is able to be adopted, like in reality. I was also wondering about, you brought up this idea of like logical consistency but in the text, like I was wondering, because it says like, but this is to condemn impartiality in word, but prefer it in deed, with the result that one's actions do not accord with what one says. So I was wondering if that's more of like, maybe it's not strictly logical inconsistency that's being identified here. It's more like you are in action acting as if like this other thing is what you endorse. So it's like a practical inconsistency, or like what we might call hypocrisy, right? So hypocrisy involves some kind of mismatch, right, between what you actually affirm and the way you act, right? Like,
Yes.
you say to everyone, and let's say you even believe in your mind that you should give 10% of all your wealth, right, to the poor, but then you actually don't do it,
Yeah.
And so it's not quite logical inconsistency, I guess, but yeah, is that the way it's put usually by philosophers? Practical inconsistency, or I guess that is hypocrisy, or that's the way I would have thought of that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Richard. I feel like that question comes somewhat out of your Western training as someone who studied a lot of Aristotle, maybe even Kant, So there's a way of reading this inconsistency between one's words and deeds, between one's professed beliefs and one's actions, as not a logical inconsistency, but a different kind of inconsistency. I mean, there are some people who say what you're calling a practical inconsistency just is derived from a logical one. But yeah, I have to say, like, having looked at a lot of the secondary scholarship on this caretaker argument, not many people entertain that view. Most think that there is some kind of concern with logical inconsistency. So what we're calling deeds, or actions, not according with what one says, I think the assumption is that this is sort of a package deal. It comes along with a principle or doctrine or something that you can articulate in words. And those words would contradict what one professes or what one claims to believe about partiality, insofar as they're promoting some more partialistic doctrine. Yeah. But it's an interesting view. Another way in which logic alone isn't doing all the work here is it's assuming that in contradiction between your words and deeds, you're going to remain more faithful to your deeds, right? That is, indeed, you prefer the impartialist caretaker, the impartialist friend, right? And so given the contradiction, you're going to resolve it in favor of impartialism. But you could be logically consistent and resolve it in favor of partialism. You could say, okay, you're right. I'm a partialist, so I guess that follows that I shouldn't pick the partialist friend. Although that already runs into a kind of contradiction problem.
I guess the Mohists are saying, but you would, for sure, you're going to pick the impartial person. You are. And just do the thought experiment and you will. Come on, if you're being honest. Okay, so if you do, in that situation, you do pick the impartial friend, let's say,
Yeah.
Okay, but then you've been saying, well, no, we should all be partial. Like you're saying impartiality is something that I think is a bad doctrine. Right. And then what
Yeah.
follows from that? Well, I mean, there's a mismatch here, right? It doesn't accord. Your actions do not accord with what you say or what you, I guess, have affirmed in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I want to flag this as an issue. Like it's not clear how much work logical inconsistency is doing. It depends a lot on what we assume about what you're calling this practical contradiction. And it also depends on how much emphasis there is on this prior commitment to doing what's best for your family, and like how flexible is that prior commitment. Another kind of issue with this particular argument that comes up, and you mentioned this once in our exchange over email, Richard, before we even met to record, is that it's not entirely clear how well this thought experiment generalizes. So like, yes, in this one case, you may prefer to entrust your family to an impartialist caretaker, but that's one kind of activity, essentially entrusting family to caretakers. There are lots of other areas of life where you might, in fact, prefer partialists, right? And so just like in your own family life, when it comes to raising your own kids, maybe you only have a certain amount of time and resources. You might prefer to be a partialist in those cases. And this is something that we do all the time in our moral thinking. We distinguish between cases where we're sort of treating someone respectfully as an equal citizen. So like when it comes to if you have a government job or if you work for a big company, you're not supposed to privilege your own family members. Members of the general public should be just as eligible for the job as like members of your own family or extended family or friends or what have you, right? And we know, of course, in fact, that isn't often the case, that people suffer from all kinds of biases and have weakness of will and so on. But still, in principle, we make this distinction, that for certain purposes like hiring or for like certain purposes like being polite to people in public spaces, you don't really make a hard and fast distinction between those who you happen to be close with and those that you don't. But then in other cases, we do make that distinction. Obviously, you don't let total strangers into your home and share your couch and space and food with them just as liberally as you do with family and close friends. So one just wonders whether it's fair of the Mohist to generalize so quickly, as they're sometimes interpreted as doing, from this one thought experiment to all matters in which partiality or impartiality might be in play.
Yeah. Like you're going on a vacation and, surely you prefer to be partial in terms of who comes with you.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Yeah, who you spend time with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe that brings us then to the second argument for partialism, which we're going to call the Filial Piety Argument.
Yeah. Do you want to read that one, Justin?
Yes. So very quickly, just like the caretaker argument, it is a response to an objection. And this time the objection seems to come from someone who at least expresses the Confucian sentiment. So we've been talking about how Confucians believe in care with distinctions that we can sometimes envision in the form of concentric circles where you have the greatest obligations and the greatest care or concern for those at the center, your immediate family members, and then a slightly lower degree of care or concern for those one circle out, like our more distant family members and close friends, and less so for those the next circle out, and so on. That Confucian view seems to be in play now when an objector raises an objection to impartial caring, and here's how it goes. The text says, "Though this is so, there are still people in the world who condemn impartiality, saying it does not seek what is beneficial for one's parents. So does it not harm filial piety?" Okay, so now this word, very Confucian term, filial piety, it's a part of the general culture, but Confucians are big defenders of filial piety. This has been introduced as a potential object of concern. It could be that impartialism contradicts or harms filial piety. So the text continues. Our teacher Mozi says, "Let us consider the case of a filial son who seeks what is beneficial for his parents. Does a filial son who seeks what is beneficial for his parents want other people to care for and benefit his parents? Or does he want other people to dislike and steal from his parents? According to the very meaning of filial piety, he must want other people to care for and benefit his parents." I'm going to come back to that line, so I'll read it again one more time. According to the very meaning of filial piety, he must want other people to care for and benefit his parents. Given this, how should one act in order to bring about such a state of affairs? Should one first care for and benefit the parents of another, expecting that they in turn will respond by caring for and benefiting one's own parents? Or should they first dislike and steal from other people's parents, expecting that they in turn will respond by caring for and benefiting one's own parents? All right. So it's introduced two policies. If you're a filial son, you could put your own family first and even go to the extreme of disliking and stealing from other people's parents. Or you could be really kind to other people's parents and then ask them to do the same for you in return, right? Those are the two choices. And how do we resolve that dilemma? It says, clearly one must first care for and benefit the parents of others in order to expect that they in turn will respond by caring for and benefiting one's own parents. And so, for such mutually filial sons to realize unlimited good results, must they not first care for and benefit other people's parents? Or should they let it be the case that filial sons are the exception and not the rule among all the people of the world? Okay, so there's a lot happening in that short passage. First of all, I think it sort of asserts or at least stipulates a definition of filial piety, where if you are filial, then by the very meaning of this word filial piety, you want other people to care for and benefit your parents. Your desire as a filial son or filial child essentially is that your parents be well off, right? That their well-being be protected and attended to, cared for, promoted, right? That's an interesting definition of filial piety. And I think it seems intuitively obvious, but once you begin to push a little bit, you'll see that there's more nuance, there's more texture there. The other interesting move it seems to make is it seems to be assuming that if you, in some sense, practice impartialism and put other people's parents, make them an equal priority, right? Or even a higher priority on some interpretations, then those benefits will, by some sort of rule of reciprocity, come back to you and your family, right? Everyone is now practicing impartialism, and that's best for everyone's parents. I think it's saying the net effect or something of practicing impartiality will be better for your parents. And if the only options are the ones that the text has laid on the table, it seems right to me that, like, if everyone is just sort of my family only, and everyone else's families be damned, if that's their view, then yeah, that's not going to be very good for your family. But if instead everyone is being really nice to each other's parents, then that means, yes, when your back is turned, when you're not there to protect them, when you're away, if your house is on fire while you're out in the fields or out on a trade mission or something, yes, your parents are going to be better cared for. It'll be better for them overall. Yeah.
Yeah, this reminds me of the game theory ideas of how if everyone just pursues their own narrow self-interest, then everyone's worse off. But actually, everyone's better off if you also consider the interests of others and you cooperate mutually. Then there's a kind of a coordination, and so everyone's better off by everyone caring about others. Now, there's also a psychological assumption, I think, here in this filial piety argument, which is if you, I guess, treat and take care of the parents of others, then they will also reciprocate and, benefit your parents as well. I guess that's just a basic psychological assumption. Yeah. Is that true?
Yeah, right. That's funny. It's actually one of the deep differences I sometimes notice between the ancient Greek tradition and ancient Chinese tradition is that there's this kind of reciprocity presupposed in the ancient Chinese tradition that's almost completely absent from, not completely, but anyway, there's a lot of ancient Greek philosophers assume that if you are a philosopher, you're in the business of talking about the good life, which is understood as the life that's best for egoistic individuals, individuals who want their own flourishing. Whereas in the classical tradition, you see again and again this assumption that, generally speaking, if you do nice things for other people, they will feel some sense of gratitude or maybe even indebtedness to you, so that there is this kind of basic feature of human motivation, human psychology, which you can get off the ground simply by being good or nice to others. So this whole idea, actually, in classical Chinese tradition of de, sometimes translated as virtue with a capital V, sometimes translated as moral charisma, seems to be operating in a number of schools of thought. And it presupposes this kind of reciprocal understanding of human psychology where if a person does a good favor to you, you'll feel a sense of gratitude and indebtedness and want to do a good favor to them in return. Yeah.
Actually, thinking about it, it makes sense, right? You take care of the parents of this other neighbor, and the neighbor, of course, feels this gratitude and natural affection for you, and therefore also your parents. And it's maybe not a bad psychological assumption. The other interesting thing about this argument is, does it really endorse impartiality? Because what's interesting is, but the reason why you're taking care of the parents of someone else is that you're trying ultimately to create the greatest benefit for your parents, right? So
Yeah.
that still seems like the ultimate or final goal is the benefiting of your parents. So I don't know if that's still necessarily like, I mean, I guess it's like in action, it is impartial in that you're now taking care of the parents of others.
Oh,
But it seems like it's a kind of an instrumental kind of reasoning going on. And yeah, I guess maybe it's still impartial, but in another way, I could see why someone might say, well, that's not true impartiality.
yes. Right. Interesting. Yeah. So is it really impartiality if you're kind to the parents of others because you're hoping then that others will be kind to your parents, which is best for your parents? So if it's all ultimately motivated by a desire that your parents be as well off as possible, or anyway, very well off, protected and cared for, then does that really count as impartiality? That's a kind of hint or clue as to what it is that Mohists understand impartiality is as. One interpretation, one move what a person could make at this point would be to say, so for the Mohists, it turns out that what they're calling caring isn't so much about like, for the sake of which people you care about their good. It's not really concerned about making that sort of distinction that you just made, Richard, between people whose good you care about as a means to some greater end or people whose good you care about for their own sake, right? Instead, it's more about this kind of like minimal emotional commitment or motivation necessary in order to promote someone's benefit. So even if you care about someone just as a means, perhaps, you count as caring, as exhibiting this attitude I toward them. That's one move you could make in defense of the Mohists, although there's a problem, which is that, as I recall, in the Mohist canons, the later Mohist texts, there's some passages that are more or less like definitions of technical terms. And as I recall, boy, I'm going to regret it if I'm wrong about this, there's a passage that suggests this word I, which we're translating as care, is roughly the attitude you have towards something you don't care about only instrumentally. So an example of caring about someone in a non-I way would be like caring about your horse. It assumes that you care about your horse as a means to other ends. But you care about yourself, for example, or maybe your family members as final goods, or you care about their well-being for their own sake. So that move that I just described would be hard to square with at least the later Mohists' views about I, as described in the Mohist canons. Another issue that comes up, I think all we can do is kind of gesture at some of the complexities of these issues and then maybe include in the show notes some of this really great secondary scholarship on these issues. Another issue that comes up for me is, it seems to me that it's presupposed a certain understanding of filial piety, where if you're a filial child, what you want for your parents is that they have benefit. The word benefit is a translation of li. Could be translated as well-being or something like that. You want your parents to be well off, You want them to flourish, you want them to be happy and so on. Whatever it is that you take to be well-being or welfare, good welfare for your parents, that's what you want for them. But I think there's what some philosophers call a problem of relevant descriptions here, because I'm not sure that it's fully captured what it is that good filial children want for their parents. What it is that good filial children want for their parents is more relational. They want their parents to be well off, but they also want to have some involvement in promoting and protecting their parents' welfare. So I'm tempted to say there are like two ways of describing the desire that filial children have for their parents. One is the kind of Mohist way, according to which it's a simple filial desire with no relational component, where you simply desire that your parents be well off. But there's a more relational filial desire where you want your parents to be well off, and you also want for you to be the one who makes them well off, who promotes and protects their interests, because you want to have some role as their child in protecting and promoting them, right? And I think nowadays people understand more intuitively the reverse relationship, the relationship of parents to children. So maybe we could reverse it to make it a little bit clearer or more salient. What is it that parents want for their children? Well, they want for their children to be, stop me if I'm wrong, Richard, but they want for their children to flourish and be well off. Surely, yes, that's a priority. But they also want to have a role, right, in raising their children and seeing to their children's interests, right? And I guess if forced to choose between the two, then admirably, many parents would say, okay, I'd rather my children be well off than for me to have a role in it. But clearly, playing some role in promoting the interests of their children is a very, very prominent, important part of those desires that parents have as good parents. So similarly, I think the assumption would be in Mohist times that many filial children want the same. And that means that they're not just obviously going to sign on to the Mohist conclusion that they would choose to put other families first in return for making sure that their families are well off. Actually, what they would choose is to both have their parents be well off and for them to be the ones who help care for and guarantee the sort of flourishing or success or well-being of their parents.
Right. So it seems like the Mohists are mostly concerned with the state of affairs, just the bare outcome of the parents, being fed and being taken care of. Yeah, there's a more of a Western view that, like it's more permissible, I think, that, for example, have your parents be taken care of in a retirement home, right? Of course, make sure the retirement home is nice, right? And good. Yeah. But there's a kind of, I know like in the kind of more Confucian, like at least I suspect same in maybe China, Japan, although I'm not sure. But in Korea, there is this expectation that you should be taking care of your parents in your own house. I don't know if that's still quite true. Maybe things have changed. I also think it's a kind of Chinese ideal, but yeah, there's a difference between just putting them into even a very nice retirement home or elderly home versus you taking care of them. You're the one who's feeding them, and so on. And so you are involved, right? Your agency is involved. It's not just a bare outcome. So I think those are two really different things. But what about in defense of this argument, what if the Mohist said, but we are involved, right? I treated, I don't know if this really works, but I treated, my neighbor's parents. I did that. So I'm part of the causal sequence in which I help to bring about and am involved with ultimately my parents, being taken care of. I mean, maybe directly the cause is, my neighbor in this case, but I'm part of that whole causal sequence. I don't know. Maybe,
right.
Would that argument or response work?
Yeah. I mean, we certainly have to consider that objection. It's a response. That's a good one. Yeah. So much depends on what it is that you think you want out of your relationships. So when I think of myself this is not going to happen to me because I don't have children, but being an elderly parent and having children care for me, it seems to me that, so surely one thing I would want in my old age is to be well cared for. So like the greatest source of anxiety for me would be to be, fully retired, not really eligible for work, not really capable of making a living, of kind of like a livelihood that would support me, and being so vulnerable that I, like the minute there's some kind of shortage of food or medicines or what have you, I'm dead, I won't be able to survive. That kind of anxiety would be pretty miserable. So in those cases, I think my highest priority would be to be well cared for, no matter who does the caring. But it really does seem to me like if we set aside those worst case scenarios, then there's a whole range of scenarios where my life will be a little less secure because I can't count on strangers to care for me as assiduously or conscientiously as I would my own children. But still, I'd feel like this deep vacancy, this kind of hole, this spiritual absence in my life, insofar as my kids are out like attending to other people's parents, with a great deal of conscientiousness, and leaving me is to play sort of second fiddle. I think I would want to be kind of like the center of the lives of my kids. So I mean, here we get into some deeper issues having to do with what really does most impartial caring commit us to? Does it commit us to equal care and concern? Does it commit us to protecting everyone's interests equally? Or are there more nuanced ways of understanding it? And that's another big issue.
Yeah, it could be quite complicated because maybe if you're not in the position to really visit your parents and bring them the actual food that you cook in their kitchen because you have other responsibilities with small kids on your own, then it could be understandable that maybe you hire a cook, right, to cook for your parents. But there is something to this point that, they want you to visit them and for you to be participating in their life, right? To be talking to them over dinner. And there is something maybe special about you having done the cooking of the meal for the dinner that they're about to eat with you, as opposed to hiring some really charming person. You outsource the cooking and the conversation, right? You hire some really great conversationalist to have dinner with them. And it's not you, but hey, you paid top dollars. Maybe you're a very wealthy man. And so you paid top dollars to go to your parents' home and entertain them and so on. But that, I guess, would still be different.
Yeah, exactly. That would be different. I guess I'm anticipating an objection that will come from Mencius or Mengzi, and I suspect someday we'll just have an episode of the podcast on Mengzi's response to impartial caring. He has a variety of arguments that are really interesting to look at. One of them is potentially interpreted as saying, like, listen, if your attitude towards your family members is the Mohist one, impartial caring, then there's a sense in which you're not really in a relationship with them. This is what in my mind I call the without a father argument in the Mencius. And yeah, there's like what it means to be in a relationship with someone is to see their interests, their well-being as making a greater claim on you. And there's a sense in which you can't really be in a relationship with others unless they have that attitude toward you. Otherwise, at some deeper fundamental level, they're treating you just like they would a total stranger. And all of the things that you expect from a relationship, the kind of psychological comfort, this sort of more unconditional, maybe not completely unconditional, but more unconditional love and concern that you get out of relationships, that's just absent if you adopt a Mohist attitude toward relationships. That's a worry. A lot depends on how we understand impartial caring. So I mentioned at the beginning, the slogan that often comes up is something like this: you regard the well-being or bodies of other people like you regard your own. You regard the families of other people like you regard your own. So there's this notion that somehow the attitude that you have towards others, if you're an impartialist, is the same as or is similar to the one that you have towards yourself. And there are kind of maximal and minimal ways of interpreting that attitude. So there is the minimal interpretation according to which all it means is that you have some care or concern. You see their interests as something to be weighed or balanced or taken into account, right? And that's essentially the Chris Fraser interpretation. I've simplified it a lot. And that interpretation has the virtue of being much more defensible, right, than more maximalist or radical interpretations. But it also just seems not to do justice to the text. So the text does raise some objections at some point, saying, well, gosh, this seems like a tall order, impartial caring. Do we really think people are capable of adopting such a demanding moral standard? And then it goes on to tell these stories about people who, after one generation being raised by a particular king, were willing to jump into fire, run into burning ships for their king, or starve themselves, or what have you. So it seems like the text acknowledges that this is not an easy doctrine to adopt, So that for that reason, among others, I'm more tempted by so-called more radical or stronger readings of jian'ai, of impartial caring. And those are defended, for example, by Alexis MacLeod has a nice article defending stronger claims. I know Brian Van Norden responded to Fraser's book, sort of reasserting the stronger claim. Let me just recommend, if you're interested in this particular issue, and certain kinds of philosophers are, Loy Huetie's article on what he calls the main argument for impartial caring, where he distinguishes between three interpretations of impartial caring. He says that you're supposed to be, if you're impartial carer, you're supposed to be impartial about benefiting others. That is, in everything you do, you're supposed to bring as much benefit to total strangers as you do your own family members, and so on. And he says that's too demanding. That's not a plausible interpretation of jian'ai. But he says there are these other interpretations according to which if you're impartial helping others, or that's a slightly weaker one, right? Like, in other words, when they're in need, when they're in some kind of dire circumstances, starving or needing of water or what have you, needing of rescue, you will help them just as you would help your own family members. And then there's an even weaker one he calls the not harming interpretation. So you're impartial while not harming. Just as you don't want to harm your own family members, you don't harm total strangers. That's much less demanding, right? It doesn't mean that every time you bring in the crops, you have to share equally with family members. And so he ends up endorsing a kind of not harming plus view. So he thinks that essentially the most plausible interpretation of jian'ai is that you're committed at least to not harming total strangers and other people who have no relationship to you, and also, under special circumstances, really dire ones, helping them. But he admits that interpretation is in tension with some passages that suggest an even more demanding standard. So I just want to mention to listeners that there are even some very interesting interpretations out there. I'm thinking of Karina Defort and her very influential article that say that there are essentially multiple interpretations of jian'ai in play in the text of the Mozi. After all, we haven't talked about them, but there are three versions of this chapter, jian'ai. And so both she and Loy Huetia, at least tentatively endorse this view that with each version of the jian'ai chapter, you see stronger and stronger or more radical versions of the doctrine at play. In the weakest versions, the first of the three chapters, you see something like you should read jian'ai as something like inclusive care, inclusive concern, more consistent with Chris Fraser's kind of modest or weak interpretation of the doctrine. But then you see it drifting towards more and more radical claims. And so that's another option you have to keep in mind, is that there were multiple schools of Mohist thought, and Mohist thought clearly was an evolving thing. We have the so-called early Mohists and the later Mohists, and it's possible that they drifted towards more and more radical interpretations of their own view over the course of generations.
Yeah. I remember talking about this. I remember it being very complicated, partly because there were these different versions of the text also and possible doctrinal development. And I remember having these conversations with old friend Young Sun Back, and back when I was a postdoc in Hong Kong. And she also has a paper on jian'ai, which I think it was published in Philosophy East and West a long time ago. It's been many years, so I can't quite remember.
I've read that. That's a good one too. I'll put that one in the show notes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. I want to plug her work. So, but yeah, no, this is extremely fascinating. And there's all kinds of really interesting questions here. Some deep conceptual philosophical questions also about just what exactly it is to be truly caring and and concerned, and what filiality requires, and different conceptions of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all of this jian'ai stuff is set against the background of the broader Mohist commitment, and I do believe it's a theoretical commitment to consequentialism, which is the view that minimally the right action is the one that maximizes some good across the population, and the good in question is what they call benefit, or Li, which seems like a close cousin to well-being. Yeah, there's always this question, to what extent do these attitudes that we're calling impartialism and impartial caring help to maximize benefit overall across the population? And maybe that too is a moving target. Maybe different Mohists thought differently about what would be demanded of us as individuals, what attitudes, what motivations, what kinds of acts of care and concern for others we should undertake in order to bring about the best for society overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Well, I think, we've discussed these passages pretty well.
We've done about as much justice as we can in a reasonable time frame. And so if you want to know more, we're going to mention some of the articles in the show notes. And then I should also say, probably we'll eventually discuss Mencius's response to Mohist impartial caring. So I don't think we have an episode lined up anytime soon on that particular topic, because we already have a lot lined up. We have a lot of guests at the end of the summer that we're interviewing. But eventually, stay tuned for that one, because we're giving ourselves plenty of time and it'll come around eventually. So with that in mind, I guess we'll say that was the way for today, and we'll see you next time. 感谢你们的收听.
Bye, everyone.